This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to answer the question, how should we pick Bitcoin Core maintainers? So let's start out with a simple thought experiment. Let's say that you were in charge of creating a team of devs that were to have write access to the most important software project in the history of the world, namely Bitcoin. Whom would you pick? Because this is literally a project that the future of humanity is depending on. If it were me, I would try to pick wise people, and I would try to pick people who understood that their job was not to radically change the software, but rather to do just simple maintenance. In other words, I would want senior devs who understood that they should do very little, rather than junior devs who were young and ambitious and wanted to leave their mark on the software. Why senior devs? While I would be willing to make an exception for the occasional quote-unquote old soul, my bias today is that people below the age of 35 or so haven't lived long enough or made enough mistakes to be wise. They might be smart, but they are quite likely not wise. This is how life teaches you. You have bad judgment, you make a bad decision, it leads to a bad outcome. You hopefully learn from your mistake and you end up with better judgment. Of course, there are lots of people over the age of 35 who've made a lot of mistakes and learned nothing, which is why I would also try to select for people who seem to have an intuitive feel for Bitcoin's history and culture. It'd be great if they'd figured out Bitcoin a decade ago and had been hodling since then, because that would give them both the Bitcoin cultural education as well as the skin in the game, in other words, the wealth, when it came to making sure that no one did anything stupid to Bitcoin's code that could be existential. Because if you're holding a lot of Bitcoin and you've been in the game for a decade, you're going to be very hesitant to make any big changes to Bitcoin's code. My preference would also be to bring in someone who wasn't a suit or a corporate type or a know-it-all academic who had never seen life outside of the ivory tower. And I also wouldn't want to bring in someone who was too young and green to be wise. I would never ever give write access to someone who was a recent college grad. And that's because I know what I was like right after graduating from college. It wasn't that I was wild or crazy or anything. I was just young and green and thought that I knew a lot more about the world than in retrospect I actually did. Is it really that important who's working on Bitcoin Core? Some people may argue, since people can just switch software implementations if they don't like what's going on. Now, while that's technically correct, it's not true in practice. We all need to be basically running the same node software, or we risk an inadvertent chain split. The good news is that Bitcoin Knots is a fork of Bitcoin Core, so we are fine on that account. The software is very, very close. But Bitcoin Core isn't like every other FOSS, free and open source software project, where you can just vote with your feet. And this is because Bitcoin Core is and has been the reference implementation. It's the one that most people still use right out of the box with its default settings. So what are in those default settings and what this software is comprised of really, really matters. And we would be quite naive if we didn't think that at some point this centralized group of people would get captured. It's quite difficult to capture Bitcoin at the protocol level, but the social layer is much more vulnerable, unfortunately. If you're finding this video interesting so far, I just pause really briefly here to ask you to help to support this channel's educational mission. Hit the subscribe button, that does really help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. So if I were picking Bitcoin Core devs, I would select for senior devs who would be doing very little over junior devs who would want to do a lot to Bitcoin. I would also openly discriminate against shitcoiners and shitcoin-adjacent people, like all those people who want to turn Bitcoin into some form of Ethereum. Lastly, here's what I would try to guard against: Bitcoin Core devs becoming too chummy with each other, because if this happens, they will always end up closing ranks to protect one another, even if Bitcoin itself suffers. Today, when I look at Bitcoin Core devs, I look at Chaincode, I look at Brink, I see a lot of very interesting overlap, and it makes me want to ask more questions about how and why certain Bitcoin Core devs have been funded. This old saying, quote unquote, we just pick the best and smartest devs. Yeah, sorry, that's not how it works anywhere. That's not how it works in Silicon Valley or any tech company that I've ever been inside of. So I'm going to suggest that there's something else going on here. Will an insider step up and enlighten us? That would be really nice, because I still think that there's something weird going on here, that because the technical justifications for ripping out the op-return filters and the way everyone has been defending those justifications, these are extremely weak technical justifications, which leads me to believe that there may be another agenda at work. Bitcoin Core and their propaganda today sound just like the COVIDians in 2020 and 2021. We're getting lots of weird pseudo-explanations that don't meet the smell test, lots of gaslighting, and then the outright abuse of raw power to force through things that nobody wants, like ripping out the Opperturn filters. Perhaps people who have had one foot in at core, brink, and chain code over the years might be able to offer all of us some insight. If you know of anyone who wants to talk about it, please let me know. I don't know him personally, but maybe this guy could enlighten us about what's been going on. This is John Newberry, who founded Brink in 2020. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video, and let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.